It is July 26, 1951. A band from Port of Spain, Trinidad, young men from one of the poorest hillside neighborhoods in the Caribbean, walks onto a stage at the Festival of Britain in London. Their instruments have no maker's name, no manufacturer, no patent. Each one started life as a 55-gallon oil barrel, discarded by a wartime industrial operation. The players have sunk the lids into concave bowls, hammered grooves into the metal, and fired the surfaces to harden the steel. No music school taught them this. They invented it in their backyards. The audience hears something no one in that hall has ever heard: a chromatic pitched percussion instrument built from industrial waste by people whose ancestors had been legally prohibited from playing any drum at all. The group is called TASPO, the Trinidad All-Steel Pan Percussion Orchestra. They are demonstrating what many have called the only entirely new acoustic instrument invented in the 20th century. Here's what nobody tells you about that moment. The same colonial laws that tried to silence Trinidadian music for nearly 70 years had ultimately pushed its musicians to this stage. The instrument forged from what those bands created, by banning everything that came before it, was now standing on a British stage. So how does a government ban produce an orchestra? To understand why this instrument had to be invented, you have to see what Trinidad was before the oil drums arrived. The island's carnival tradition begins in the 1780s, when French planters and their enslaved Africans arrived under a Spanish colonial policy called the Cédula de Población. Those planters brought masquerade traditions from the French West Indies, but it was the enslaved Africans who gave carnival its pulse. They preserved what they had carried across the Atlantic: the rhythms of West African drum traditions, the call and response of what would become calypso, and the Camboulé procession, from the French can brûlé, meaning burnt cane. A harvest celebration carried out with torches and percussive noise. In 1834, emancipation arrived. Former enslaved Africans moved into the hills east of Port of Spain, particularly to an area called Laventille. They brought canboulé with them. Then the colonial authorities decided that noise, specifically African noise, was a threat. In 1881, Port of Spain's police captain, Arthur Baker, marched into Carnival to suppress the canboulé procession. Violence broke out across the island. 3 years later, the colonial government formalized the suppression. The 1884 Peace Preservation Act prohibited public drumming, the carrying of torches, the blowing of horns, and the assembly of 10 or more people carrying sticks. Not a permit system. A blanket ban on the instruments of African musical culture. Take away the drum, and Trinidadians built a new one. The tambour bamboo appeared in the 1890s. Lengths of bamboo cut to different diameters: boom, fillet, cutter, chandler, each producing a different pitch when stamped on the ground or struck with a stick. For 40 years, bamboo was the percussion of Trinidad's streets. Then the authorities banned the bamboo too. By the mid-1930s, bands in Laventille were playing an orchestra of frying pans, dustbin lids, and oil drums. And that is where the machinery of the 20th century enters the story. Here is the receipt. The 1939 carnival season produced the first all-steel band on record, a group called Alexander's Ragtime Band, organized by a man named Alexander Ford, in Laventille. One of its members was an 11-year-old boy named Elie Manette. That detail matters. The instrument that would eventually sit in the Smithsonian Institution and the Metropolitan Museum of Art was first played by a child in a poor Trinidadian neighborhood with no formal training, using found metal. Not a manufacturer's experiment, not a conservatory project. A child's improvisation in a carnival yard. Manatee's contribution was specific and transformable. He was, by most accounts, the first person to use a discarded 55-gallon oil barrel, as opposed to biscuit tins or soap boxes, as the raw material for a steel pan. He discovered that by sinking the lid of the drum into a concave shape, you created a tensed playing surface. More importantly, the concave shape created physical separation between notes. You could now hammer different pitched zones into a single instrument, a phenomenon impossible in a flat surface. Then he fired the metal. The heat changed the acoustic properties, tightening the steel and extending the sustain. In those two steps, the sink and the firing, Manette created the design architecture that all modern steel pans still follow. Meanwhile, in the same hillside neighborhood, a teenager named Winston Spree Simon was solving a different problem: range. In 1943, Simon was 13 years old. He produced an 8-note ping-pong pan. The name ping-pong came from the sound, a clear, high, bell-like tone unlike anything in the Western orchestral tradition. By 1946, Simon had expanded to a 14-note instrument. Carnival musicians in Laventille could now play melodies, not just rhythm. The steel band had moved from percussion to melody, from noise by colonial definition to music by anyone's. Both young men performed for carnival bands at a moment when carrying a metal instrument through the street was safer than carrying bamboo. No colonial ordinance had yet specifically banned an oil drum. The legal gap was brief, but it was enough. By 1941, the U.S. Navy had established a presence in Trinidad under a wartime leasing agreement that turned the Chaguaramas Peninsula over to American forces. That naval presence brought audiences. American sailors heard the steel band and spread word of it. Panists helped popularize the music among the troops, and those men returned home to the United States carrying the sound with them. Anthony Williams, a younger innovator working in the same tradition, designed the fourths and fifths arrangement, an organization of notes following the circle of fifths that made the lead pan dramatically more playable for melodic improvisation. That arrangement is now the global standard. Every professional panist in the world today plays an instrument organized the way Anthony Williams organized it. By 1947, the modern steel pan, chromatic, concave, fired, tuned to the circle of fifths, was essentially the instrument we know today. And that is when Taspo got their invitation to London. Why Trinidad? The steel pan could theoretically have been invented anywhere colonized Africans were suppressed and industrial waste existed, but it wasn't. The answer lies in a particular collision of geography, economics, and political history that existed in no other place in quite the same way. Start with the oil. Petroleum was discovered near Point Fortin in southwestern Trinidad in 1906. In 1907, the first commercial oil well was sunk. By the Second World War, Trinidad was one of Britain's most important Caribbean oil operations. And then the Americans moved in. The 1940 Destroyers for Bases Agreement leased the Chaguaramas Peninsula to the United States. American military infrastructure spread across the island, and with it came 55-gallon oil drums by the thousands. After the war, those drums were discarded. They were everywhere, in yards, on roadsides, behind refineries. They were free. And in Laventille, they were close. Laventille is a hillside community directly east of Port of Spain. After emancipation in 1834, many formerly enslaved Africans settled here. It was marginal land, steep, difficult to build on, the kind of place no colonial planner wanted. That marginalization meant Laventille developed its own carnival tradition, largely outside official oversight. The pan yards, where steel bands practiced, were neighborhood institutions. Different bands claimed different yards, different streets, sometimes different hilltops. They were competitive, sometimes violently so. That competition drove innovation. If a rival band developed a new note arrangement, your band needed an answer. If one yard produced a pan with better sustain, the next yard found a way to improve the sync. The competitive structure of carnival, organized around neighborhood identity and enforced by the geography of Laventille's hillside clusters, turned instrument building into an arms race. No other Caribbean island had quite this combination. A deep carnival tradition built around street percussion, a colonial history aggressive enough to ban multiple instruments in sequence, an industrial economy that left oil drums as debris, and a concentrated urban settlement whose cultural geography made neighborhood-level musical competition the organizing principle of creative life. The bamboo ban, the oil economy, the hillside geography, the carnival competition. Pull any one of those out, and the instrument doesn't happen. That is not coincidence. That is place. Taspo's London performance changed what the word instrument could mean. But the world didn't move quickly. For a decade, the steelpan was considered a novelty. Interesting enough for a 1954 Broadway musical. House of Flowers incorporated steel pans after Trinidadian dancer Jeffrey Holder recommended it. But not yet taken seriously as a concert instrument. Ellie Mannett changed that by leaving Trinidad. In the early 1960s, he accepted an invitation to bring the instrument to an inner-city youth program in New York. From 1967 onward, Mannett built several hundred steel bands across American colleges and universities. West Virginia University invited him in 1991 to formalize that teaching. The project became Mannett Steel Drums, which still builds instruments today. Carnival tradition traveled with the Trinidadian diaspora. Toronto's Caravana, London's Notting Hill Carnival, New York's Labor Day Carnival, all carry steelpan traditions. Brooklyn's annual Steel Band Panorama has run since 1972. The Desperados Steel Orchestra, formed in Laventille in 1945, performed at Carnegie Hall in 1987, and with Luciano Pavarotti in Barbados in 1997. They have been a Panorama finalist 53 of 57 times. In 1992, Trinidad and Tobago declared the steelpan its national instrument. In 2024, Parliament formalized that by statute. And in 2023, the United Nations General Assembly declared August 11th World Steelpan Day, the only instrument on Earth to receive that designation. In 2000, Mannett returned to Trinidad for the first time in 33 years to receive an honorary doctorate from the University of the West Indies. The boy who had been too busy building instruments to study music abroad came home as a doctor of music. So, how does a government ban produce an orchestra? By removing every option except ingenuity. The skin drum went. The bamboo went. What was left was industrial refuse. And people who had spent 2 centuries preserving their musical culture in backyards, after dark, against the law. They already knew how to build an instrument from nothing. The oil drums gave them the right material at the right moment. The government tradition that banned drumming in 1884 was, 108 years later, officially celebrating the instrument the ban had inadvertently created. Suppression became heritage. Prohibition became national identity. What many have called the only acoustic instrument the 20th century produced. Born not in a laboratory or conservatory, but in Laventille, on a steep hillside in a neighborhood the colonial planners didn't want, emerged from the hands of teenagers with discarded oil barrels, which raises a question this channel will keep returning to. How many other sounds are still waiting in the places the world has decided not to look?